Welcome to the Virtual Real Estate Investing Podcast. Super pumped for our guest today. Frank, how you doing, man?
Doing awesome. Just came out of another closing and get some cash into the business. So any day you do that is a good day. So I'm in a great mood. How about yourself?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I was on vacation. Vacation was good, but then, you get overwhelmed coming back from vacation. It's now Thursday. I feel like I got my swagger back. So I'm pumped and really excited about our podcast guest today.
Yeah, we got Kirby. He's not only in one of our mentorship groups, the 80/20 Academy, but he's also a West Point grad like you and I. So we're super fortunate to have him on. Kirby, how are you doing?
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to be here, guys. I am a huge fan of your show and everything that you guys are doing. So I love being here. It's I just listened to the Austin episode that you guys put out. I forget his last name, but
Lenny.
Man, I love that episode. That was I agreed with so many things on there. So if you're listening to this and haven't checked out that one, that's a great one.
Yeah, he was great. Tons of energy, right?
Yeah,
I love his energy. It's like contagious. You're like, I know if I'm with this guy, I'm going to succeed. It's great.
Exactly.
So, Kirby, we've talked about short-term rentals, right? Like you're the short-term rental guy, which I'm super excited to get into. I know you got a course coming up that we're going to get into, but let's just start about the journey a little bit, right? And the reason I want to start with the journey, usually we start with just what you're doing today, but because you're the first guy we've had on to really dig into short-term rentals, like how did you end up there? You said you had a long-term rental portfolio and then you've recently sold that off and you're just going all in on short-term rentals. So I'd like to hear your story a little bit and kind of how you got to this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll go way back to start. So I kind of growing up had a little bit of a rich dad, poor dad experience myself. Not as extreme as the book, but my dad and my mom growing up, I got to see kind of a big juxtaposition in two different types of occupations, I guess. So my dad, he was a director of a park district, very successful, but it was a government job and a very secure job. And I got to see kind of the pros and cons of that. And then my mom owned her own insurance brokerage and she was an entrepreneur. She ate what she killed, started with absolutely nothing, and just went out and started writing insurance plans for small businesses. And so her job was much more flexible, but also it was not as secure, I guess, or not that secure 9-to-5 that you would imagine. So growing up, I was really attracted to her line of work, that whole thing of like, the harder you work, the more it's going to pay you, as opposed to that, a fixed amount that no matter how many hours you work, you're going to get paid the same. So I knew I was going to be an entrepreneur, wanted to serve in the military. My dad was like, if you're going to go in the military, you might as well be an officer because they don't do anything. They just sit around and tell people what to do. So he obviously was enlisted. So I played football at the time and applied to West Point, got in the back door through football, went to prep school for a year and then got up to West Point. And I think it was my fourth day at West Point, I got cut from the football team. So it was a long, illustrious football career at West Point. Thanks, Coach Barry. He went on to win one football game while I was there. So
that's a nice dig. That's a good dig.
I told him he would have kept me,
Right? It made all the difference.
That's right. So anyways, fast forward, get out of West Point. I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It really resonated with me. And I bought a rental property in El Paso where I was first stationed. And then I went on from there to buy several more in El Paso and then in Hawaii when I got stationed there. And I knew it was something I was going to do full time when I got out. And then I got out in 2011 and I realized that buying rental properties with conventional financing like I had previously wasn't going to work because I no longer had a W-2. So I just started flipping because I thought, this is the way you make money in real estate if you don't have access to long-term financing. And at the time, they didn't have these 30-year fixed interest loans for LLCs, for investment properties on single family homes. Like that just didn't exist. Now you can go out and get a 4% loan on any street corner practically for 30 years fixed on a rental property, which is incredible. It changes the game. So I started flipping, and we ended up flipping. I partnered with two friends from high school, and we flipped about 70 properties around Chicago from 2011 to 2016. And I looked up in 2016 after having built this business with, a bunch of employees. We had 12 or 13 employees. We had a pretty decent sized office. We had, all the things that you think of as a successful business having. And we were invited to speak at a bunch of RIAs and different events and stuff. And because people were recognizing us as being really successful. And I looked up and looked at my finances and realized that literally I was not in any better position than when I first started 5 years previously. And we made millions. Like, we're a 7-figure business, which everyone talks about being a 7-figure business. But we spent just as much, because as we were growing, we got up to $10,000, $20,000 in marketing per month. We were hiring more people to field all the calls from all the yellow letters that we were sending out. Then we needed project managers to manage all the projects. At our peak, we had 22 different projects going at one time, some under contract to buy, some under rehab, and some, on the back end to sell. But it became this, and I wasn't doing any of the fun stuff that I had been doing when we first started. When we first started with our first project, it was awesome. Like, I was on site with the contractors. I was talking to sellers. I was doing all this fun stuff. By the end, I was just managing people problems, complaints by our staff, problems with callers, with sellers, and, all the issues that came up, managing all the investor relationships. And so I realized I just created this hamster wheel that I couldn't get off, that I was like stuck in, and it just consumed way more of my time. And financially, I had no assets. So at that point, I realized I needed to shift into the reason why I got into real estate in the first place. And that was, rental properties, creating financial freedom. And so my partners want to continue with flipping. And I said, Godspeed. They bought me out of that company, and I went on to start Green Vet Homes, which was my rental company. And I switched strategies at that point. And I'll come up for air and see if there's anything that you guys want to ask before I move on.
Well, before we get into the short-term rentals in your current biz, I had a thought and a question. So when your first year flipping houses, right, doing trying to get cash in your pocket, right? There probably was a point where you and your two buddies did all the work yourselves, which you kind of alluded to. Mm-hmm. And then you probably did like 5 or 10 of them. And at that point, you're probably very profitable, I would imagine, right? Mm-hmm. When did you decide to scale, and maybe what regrets do you have through that process?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I wouldn't say we were very profitable. So like the first one, for instance, we bought a property. It ended up being a great flip. It went super quick because we were like all over it. We were visiting the property every day, making sure every detail was taken care of, all over the contractors. And we made like 40 grand on it, which was awesome. But that was, 3-4 months later when we sold it. And that 40 grand paid for all the expenses over the last 3 or 4 months, because it's divided 3 ways. You got taxes, you got all the overhead. So then we started doing multiple at the same time. So, because we thought, if we have to, in order to create more revenue. So it was always like, we scaled out of this need, or this fear, I guess, that this isn't enough to sustain us, what we're doing. So obviously the answer is higher end projects. So we moved from the south side to the north side of Chicago and started doing $1 million luxury type houses. And we needed to do more. So we brought on staff to be able to get more. That got us into a whole nother set of problems, because, $1 million+ buyers have a $50,000 punch list after they get the property under contract that they want you to take care of. They're just much more picky. It's just a totally different game that we didn't anticipate. So I guess to answer your question, it was always, the scaling was out of, number one, it was because everyone said that's what you're supposed to do to be successful. And number two, it was because we just knew that what we're doing right now wasn't enough to get ahead. And we thought the answer to get ahead was just bigger and more.
So I want to double down on that a little bit, because I feel like we might be on that same trajectory. Hopefully we're not, right? But we are like scale. We're doing things virtually, which hopefully cuts down our expenses.
Yep.
We're using, a lot of foreign virtual assistants that hopefully cuts down our expenses. But every time we're growing, I have this voice in my head that says, hey, we need to make sure we don't go along the same trajectory Kirby did, where he's like, hey, we got bigger, but the bottom line didn't really grow, right? So I've asked you this multiple times, but let's do it on the air here. How can we make sure that we don't make the same mistake as we look to scale?
Yeah, the main thing is I just look at profit, and I look at also my return on time now too, because that was the big thing. We were doing these luxury flips that one of the things I didn't anticipate is I needed to be on site way more than I was for a $200,000, $300,000 flip. Those are cookie cutter decisions. As long as it's neutral decisions, it meets the requirements for most buyers. They're happy with it. You're going to be okay. For a $1 million+ house, at least in that market, that's a high-end house. You bring in a designer. The details have to be perfect, and so it didn't scale. Number one, so my return on time wasn't in sync, and then number two is just we didn't pay close attention to the profit. We just kept thinking, as long as we're growing, as long as we're scaling, then we're good, and it'll all work itself out. And that just isn't. You have to, on a monthly basis now. I sit down with my bookkeeper, and I know exactly how much I've spent, how much I've made, and how much profit there is. And it's not like you're always going to be profitable, but you can at least plan then and know, okay, I wasn't this month because I did this, but I'm going to be really profitable next month because I've got this coming up or whatever. But we were kind of just operating, and it just had grown so quickly and so big that we didn't have a good handle on where everything was and what our profit margin was.
So now let's go back to the short-term rental side of things. So you did the hustle, you did the hamster wheel, you slowed it down. You were in long-term rentals.
Yeah.
Now you've decided to pivot into short-term rentals. So take us through that decision and how that's going right now.
Yeah. So that was kind of two transformations there. So when I started Green Vet Homes in 2016, I just found out about this voucher program that provides a voucher similar to a Section 8 voucher to homeless veterans. And I was like, this is awesome. It made sense to me. And being a veteran myself, I was like, I felt like I would have the rapport with the homeless vets, and I wanted to get involved. So I found out everything I possibly could about it, kind of built my business around it. So I started buying, rehabbing, renting, and refinancing properties specifically for homeless vets in this program. So I met the woman who runs it in Chicago, or in Cook County, right outside of Chicago, in all the suburbs around Chicago where I was buying. And basically I would let her know, I just found a house. It's a 3-bedroom. I'm fully renovating it. I'll need, it'll be ready for a veteran who has a 3-bedroom voucher in the next 4 months, 3 months, whatever. And so she would start to line somebody up, a veteran up to move in. And so started going through this, and it worked really well. And so I did research, found areas where the price points were low, but the rent rates were high. And I looked at a spreadsheet and I was like, all right, if I have no overhead, I'm not going to get an office. Kind of like you said, everything's going to be virtual. I'm paying attention to my overhead. I'm going to do what I can do myself and then hire when it's absolutely necessary. And I looked at a spreadsheet and I was like, all right, if I can do 24 of these projects, and each one I build in $40,000 of equity by burring it, and each one creates $500 of cash flow, then at the end of this, and if I do one every other, or it was one a month. Yeah, it was one a month for 2 years is what my plan was. So for 2 years, I can do 24 properties. At the end of it, I'll have $1 million net worth, and I'll have $12,000 of income coming in forever. And so it was very like elementary math. It was just like, but I was like, this is my plan. And I'm not going to take on any overhead along the way. So started doing that. And about 2 years later, I had 26 units. And one of them was an 11 unit apartment. So it wasn't exactly how I had planned it out with single family homes, but it was basically right there. But it was very sporadic, and it was very management intensive. And so I tried to find managers, but with it being vouchers, it was very management intensive. So at the same time, I was moving over to Northwest Indiana, which is an area where it doesn't work as well. There's just not the demand, and the payment is much lower. And so I wanted to find something else that provided really high cash flow, and was still, I could still be accumulating assets with the same type of, low price point to high cash flow. And so that's when I got into short-term rentals.
Before we get into no, I have to ask a question. So you said 40 grand forced equity or forced appreciation and $500 cash flow. How are you finding? That's a good deal, man.
Yeah.
Like no matter what way you shake it, that's a good deal. How are you finding them at that time?
Initially, it was my wife driving me, and I would get out of the car and put up bandit signs on the side of the road. I'd use zip ties, and that way they'd stay up as long as possible. And they worked really well in the south suburbs of Chicago. And so I got some of the absolute best deals from bandit signs, because the only people that call you from bandit signs are people who either have distress in their life or there's a distressed property. It's people who don't want to list on the MLS. So, that was the main way I was finding deals. And then once I started doing a lot of deals in the same area, I was only looking in 3 communities where the price points were low and the rent rates were high. Then people started to know that I was looking there. They started referring more deals to me. And I didn't have to do bandit signs as much, but that was my main marketing strategy.
I like it. One of the things Frank and I have talked about, and I think we have these aspirations that there's a way to fix Class D housing in America. Okay. And I'm going to ask you a big question, but you seem more qualified than us. So I want your insight, right? So we have A, B, C, and D classes of houses out there, right? A, I always say, are where the doctors live. B is where the teachers live. C is where the plumbers live. And D is where, could be dangerous at night, right? And generally, as real estate investors, we're told stay away from Class D houses, right? Like management intensive, you're going to have to go through evictions. Like, a lot of times those houses aren't going to appraise, so just stay away from them. And that's fine, right? But Frank and I have talked a bunch about, like, what if there is a solution to inject cash into some of these communities and help some of these communities turn around? So how do you think, this is my big question time, how do you think America can tackle some of the Class D issues with housing and real estate investing and lending? Do you have any big thoughts there?
Big question, man.
Yeah.
No, I do have some thoughts. I think, so for me, it was a very fine line between Class C and Class D, where I was investing. I felt Class C, it was kind of on the border of some areas that would definitely be Class D. And the only reason that this model worked really well for me is because there was government intervention, really. I mean, that the rent rates were artificially much higher than they would have been had I rented to a market rate tenant. And that was because most landlords, heard homeless veteran and they just automatically said no, because PTSD, alcohol, drugs, whatever they thought was going to come into their house. And so they didn't want to do it. And so they had to incentivize landlords to do it with a little bit higher rent rate. Without any government intervention, I think it would be very difficult. But even with government intervention, I don't think it's necessarily, like, I was doing it because I had a passion for helping vets. There's other landlords that would do it and do the absolute bare minimum on the house to get it to pass the safety standards and get a homeless vet in there. And then they just collected a check. So I think, I think it's, obviously, if it was an easy answer, it would have already been solved. But I think it's a much bigger structural issue in terms of, there needs to be a lot of work before it gets to that point. Because once it's Class D, the price points are at a point where even if you rehab it, it's worth way less than what you're putting into it. So that's why these places just sit there. If there was value in it, it wouldn't matter how dangerous it is. There's investors that would go in there, but if you're buying a house for 20 grand and you put 50 grand into it to rehab it and it's worth 30 grand, then it just doesn't, the economics don't make sense. So that's why the government jumps in and tries to get involved. But, I think it's got to go back to, why did it become a Class D, area in the first place, and start to address those issues, which are a lot of times family issues and other issues that lead to that place, instead of trying to address the manifestation of those issues, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like we do a good job of subsidizing cash flow, right? Meaning like you can cash flow because they're providing rental payments for the disabled veteran or the Section 8 tenant, right?
Right.
But there's no one subsidizing the equity, and that's actually the problem, right?
Yeah.
Like the equity in a $50,000 home in 2008 is still worth $50,000 in 2021, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem. So it's like, how do you? I was telling John, like, how do lenders with government backing like actually inject liquidity into that market? Until that happens, like, it's just, no landlord is going to drop 20 grand on a kitchen. It's not happening, right?
Exactly.
Can't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so I think there's got to be more of a focus on the issues that lead to that place, because it's so hard to fix once you're already there.
I think that was a great answer, and I know that was a big question. And we don't have to solve all the world's problems today, but let's try to solve how does one get into short-term rentals? Let's start with your story. So you make the switch, you start deciding, hey, it's time to get into short-term. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so we moved over to Northwest Indiana, like I talked about, which is about an hour outside of Chicago, and we bought, as a good rehabber would, a really piece of crap house on Lake Michigan. So it was right on the beach, overlooking Lake Michigan, but it was like all original 1972 from when they built it, and it needed a lot. So we're gutting this house anyway, and it's got a walkout basement, and we're like, why don't we? It's unfinished. Why don't we just spend $30,000 more, turn it into a 1-bedroom apartment, and try this Airbnb thing? Like, I keep hearing how profitable it can be. The reason I think a lot of people have that same feeling, like, I should do this. And then they look at Airbnb and they're like, okay, one property rents for 100, one property rents for 300. Some are booked, some aren't. If I put money into something, how do I know it's going to rent? And so we're just like, why not start with our own house? We'll spend 30 grand. The house is probably worth 30,000 more now that we've got a 1-bedroom apartment in the basement. So we're really not out anything if it doesn't work. We got it done. We put it on Airbnb, and it was like crazy demand. Like, I mean, immediately just messages coming in, bookings coming in, and looking back, we could have optimized our price a lot better, and made a lot more money. But the way it was, it paid for 3/4 of our mortgage. We only listed it in the summer because my wife was we had a steep driveway. She thought, with the ice, someone was going to slip down the driveway and sue us. So she just wanted to rent it in the summer. We rented in the summer. It paid for 3/4 of our mortgage for the whole year. And we were like, this is insane. And it wasn't even something we were expecting. And it impacted our life almost not at all, because there was a separate entrance. People came and went. We got to meet a couple cool people that came, and we screened the guest really hard. So that's when I was like, we got to scale this. And I started doing it in the nearby town in Michigan City, Indiana, where the price points, again, are very affordable, low taxes, but there's a huge demand for Airbnb, like most places. And so I started buying single family homes and scaling it. And once I started that process, I realized this is where my passion is. I love providing just an amazing experience for people. I'm slightly OCD, and I like my properties to be kept absolutely pristine at all times. So when I was rehabbing them, making them that way, and then renting them to a homeless veteran, sometimes they would get destroyed, and it would like drive me up a wall. So I realized that wasn't the strategy for me long term, and it was very hard to manage back in Illinois. So I decided I'm going to sell off all those properties and take that equity. There's a opportunity zone in Michigan City, so I could roll the equity tax-free into an opportunity zone investment into some of these properties that I was rehabbing anyway. and say, not have to pay capital gains on that money when I was selling off the rental. So that became my new strategy, and I have not looked back. It's just been amazing, and it's been a game changer financially for our family too, because it's you don't need that many when the cash flow is this high to get to financial freedom.
That's interesting. I didn't know that you could do opportunity zone investments on single family homes. You can?
Oh yeah. As long as you're rehabbing it, you're rehabbing at least 50% of the value of the property, then any piece of real estate qualifies.
That's amazing. That's awesome, man. So on your cookie cutter, like 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in Michigan City, what does that house typically look like from a pricing perspective? And then what return are you aiming to get on your short-term rental?
Yeah, I'm actually, it's funny. I'm going to do a Facebook Live on this next week, but there's a property that was one of the first ones I bought. I bought it for $39,000. The lead came in from a Facebook ad that I had put up, and it needed rehab. The guy got halfway through rehab and walked away. It needed, I put in about $55,000 to rehab it and make it really nice. I mean, really nice finishes. It's 1,000 square foot, 3-bed, 1-bath home. And this was early on, and I really didn't know how to run the numbers. So I was just trying to be as conservative as I could. So I just assumed that if the average rent was $90 a night, which I knew was very conservative, and at a 66% occupancy, basically 20 out of 30 days are booked, the numbers still worked. And so that's the way I ran the numbers. But it turned out to be much better than that. So that house as a long-term rental would rent for about $950 a month. You could get $950 to $1,100, somewhere in there. But since starting to rent that on Airbnb in the winter, I usually get about $1,500 to $2,000 a month on that as a rental. It's mostly long weekends that I'm renting it out for. And then in the summer, I'm making about $5,000 a month in the summer months. And so obviously as a short-term rental, you have more expenses. You've got your cleaning fees, you've got your utilities, you got to cut the grass. But it's minimal expenses, when you think of an extra 5 times as much cash flow. So that's generally around where it is. That one isn't my best performer. I've some of the 2 units, actually, I have two units. They've been fantastic because you get 3 listings out of those. You list each unit individually, and then you list the whole building together as one. And so in the summer, when families travel, they'll pay a lot more to rent the whole building because, it's a big group. And then in the winter, you have the versatility of just renting smaller units to smaller groups that are traveling just for like long weekends and coming to visit the casino or the outlet mall or wineries or whatever.
So when you underwrite these units, do you underwrite them? Do you feel like you can underwrite them with short-term rental projections, or is it more conservative to underwrite them like, hey, if we had to convert these to a 12-month rental, is that how you underwrite them? And then also, how is your underwriting, or kind of, for someone not familiar with those terms, how do you looking at the numbers? How has that matured or evolved over the years?
Yeah, good question. So for me, being very conservative, that is how I looked at it. Because I especially in the beginning, I didn't know that this would work. So I was like, worst case scenario, I'm going to convert this back to a long-term rental, and you chalk it up as, lesson learned. But then it took off, not only our house, but then the first single family house really took off as well. And I was like, this works well. So, I like that feeling of knowing that in a worst case scenario, COVID number 2 happens and, Airbnb goes defunct, whatever the situation, I can convert them all back to long-term rentals and I'm still okay. But the longer you do it, the more you start to get tempted by the cash flow. Because I look at some other areas. I feel like we're doing very well and it's an extremely affordable area. But, you look at other areas that are like beachfront, on the ocean, or, Orlando near the, Disney World. And some of these Airbnbs are just absolutely killing it. Now, a lot of those will not work as long-term rentals. So they were hammered when COVID happened and they had all their guests cancel. They had to carry that, and it's usually a pretty expensive property. But it's kind of a trade-off. So I personally recommend that you can use them as long-term rentals, but different people have different appetites for risk. And so, and then in terms of how I look at them, it's similar to running, you kind of run it two different ways. So you run it as a real estate investment, or the way I look at it, you run the numbers as a real estate investment first and make sure it works first as a real estate investment. Like if it was a long-term rental, are you building equity in it? Does it have stable cash flow? Is this a solid investment if this new thing, this like Airbnb thing doesn't work out? And then you run it as an Airbnb, which is like the icing on the cake. So I look at Airbnb, look at the comps, see what they're renting for. I use conservative numbers and I see what it'll rent for that way. And so usually if it works out well as a standard solid rental property, long-term rental, it's going to work out really well as a short-term rental. So that's how I look at it.
So we're conservative underwriters as well. So we share that trait with you. But one thing I've learned about being a conservative underwriter in 2021 is that if you're too conservative, you get priced out of a lot of deals.
Yeah.
How have you changed your standards as the market's gotten more competitive?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've given up some of the equity basically. So I'm still doing rehabs, which I always tell people the only reason you rehab is to make a whole bunch of equity. Because if there's no equity in it after your rehab, buy something turnkey off the market. So I've bought a few turnkey properties, which I said I'd never do because I've rehabbed over 100 properties and it's like a sin to me to buy something turnkey. But I've accumulated equity just in buying it turnkey and not having the downtime of doing the rehab. I immediately put it on Airbnb, started cash flowing at a high rate. It actually worked out really well buying turnkey. And then I'm also taking on some rehabs that have less equity in them. They'll still have equity, but less than typically I would have in the past, just to kind of keep my guys moving. But I don't need to do. The great thing about this is, I ran the numbers and I was like, all right, each of these conservatively on average is going to make $1,000 of cash flow a month. So I'm like, if I can get to 8, then I feel really good from a cash flow standpoint. I've got a whole bunch of equity in the properties, and I was still working a W-2 job for, I was the CFO of Bunker Labs for the last 4 years, but I was, I knew I was going to go back to doing real estate full time, and so I was like, if I get to 8 of these properties, I'll feel really good about the income just supporting my family, and it frees me up to do whatever I want, basically. So I can leave the full-time role. That's why I've developed this program. I've worked super hard on this program, probably harder than I should have, on this program to teach others to do this exact same thing, how to get their first short-term rental. So it takes people who are working a day job, they have no passive income, and it shows them how to find, buy, and set up their first really high cash flowing short-term rental. Because that first one is like the hardest. Once you have the first one done, you've got a blueprint, you've got, a template that you can just kind of knock it out. So if your financial freedom number is 8,000 and each one is producing 1,000, you just do the exact same thing 8 times and you're financially free.
Yes. And then what does your funding look like now for these, right? And how are bankers underwriting them? Are they still looking at, 1.25 debt service coverage ratio, or do you have to sell them on, the short-term rental revenue potential? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So to buy them up front, since the majority have been rehabs, it's been, my money, equity from properties I've sold, or it's been private money. And they're pretty low price point properties. So it's not like I needed a massive amount of private money. So I'd buy them, rehab them with the private money. Usually with most lenders, it's a 6-month seasoning. So as soon as you hit the 6-month mark, they'll appraise the property and then they give you 75% of the appraised value. So a lot of them do want to see a lease, and some of them don't really care about the lease. So, co-hosting is a big thing where somebody signs a lease and then they're technically renting it under them. So you can get creative and get a long-term lease by partnering with somebody. But it just depends on the lender if they even care about that, because more and more are saying we'll just accept the short-term rental revenue, and they can see, they'll just look at the Airbnb history basically.
Gotcha. And then what about regulations? How do regulations come into play, and are you worried about them at all? We did an offsite in Savannah and love Savannah. We're like, dude, we got to come up. We got to get a bunch of short-term rentals here.
Yeah.
This place is awesome. Talked to one of our buddies and he's like, yeah, there's some regulations that you guys might want to dig into before you get too excited. So how does that come into play for you?
Yeah, that's another one that is a huge concern for people. And it should be. So basically like 80% of the US right now has either made a regulation that is very easy to follow, almost like there's no restriction, or they haven't made a ruling on it. Then there's like 15% that have made rulings that are a little bit more stringent, but you're still able to do Airbnbs. You just have to follow the guidelines. And then there's 5% like Denver, Vegas. It sounds like Savannah. I haven't looked at Savannah, but where they say no Airbnbs. Now, if you go on Airbnb and go search Denver or search Las Vegas, there's 300 results that come up, which is the maximum number of results that will come up on Airbnb. So somehow, some way, hosts have figured out a way to still do Airbnb in every single market that exists. So not that I'm saying that you should go break the law, but there's a lot of times there's ways to work around it with co-hosts or with creative strategies. Now, if I'm investing and I'm like picking a market, I'm not going to choose Denver or Las Vegas to invest in, because why fight uphill the whole way? But it's such a hard thing to enforce that, the Airbnb police don't show up typically in the middle of the night, but if something happens, they will, like if there's a complaint or something. So why even get in that situation when 80% of the country says it's either fine or, they haven't made a ruling and it's not an issue enough that they even needed to make a ruling. So I mean, it can happen and it can change, but there's so many, especially the bigger markets have pretty much all made a ruling one way or the other at this point. But I like to focus on the tertiary markets, the areas where, I'm an hour outside of Chicago and I'm buying properties at $39,000, but there's still a massive demand. Every single day in the summer, I'm booked up on all my properties. So you don't have to be in like downtown Chicago to get your properties rented. Why fight with all the bureaucracy there when you can be here where there's no restrictions at all?
Yeah, and it's funny, and the public has generally accepted that for a full hotel room, you're going to spend $100 a night, right?
Yeah.
If you're in downtown Denver and it's a dump, it's going to be $100 a night. And if you're in Michigan City, it's $100 a night, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty awesome. So I'm a student. I call you. I'm like, Kirby, I need help. I want to get in the STR game. It's month number 1. Like, what steps are you advising them to take days 0 through like day 30 or maybe day 60? And then how long do you expect them to have to execute those steps to like get some results, maybe get a deal or have their first rental on the market? Like, what do you teach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I interviewed about 55 people who are in my Facebook group who are interested or have done short-term rentals, and tried to figure out like, what are the biggest roadblocks? What's the fastest way to get you from not having a property to having a property? Because what I've seen is that there's a lot of short-term rental programs out there. A lot of them will overcompensate with not having a transformation with a whole bunch of information. So they'll say, we're going to have 100 modules that give you everything you ever needed to know about Airbnb. But I could go to Google for that. Obviously, that hasn't worked. So I set this program up very intentionally. It's a cohort style program. So it's going to start September 9th. and we will go through week by week together over a 6-week period, and it builds on itself. And so I basically am just going to go over the things that you need to actually get a property over 6 weeks. So it is like going to be my total intention, everything I have, to make sure that everyone who goes through this ends up with a high cash flowing short-term rental at the end of it. So that's the whole point behind it. Obviously, it can only scale so big. You know, I can't have 500 people in that, because once a week we'll do the lesson, and it'll start with like, what is your goal? Like, where, you know, to people ask me all the time, where should I invest? The biggest factor in that is you as the investor. Like, what do you want out of this? Like, you have to figure out at the end of it all, like, what do you want your life to look like? And then I can start to narrow down places to invest that will determine whether you should invest remotely or invest, you know, be more hands-on, you know, and should you invest in a high cash flowing market or maybe more appreciation and that sort of thing. So we'll figure that out, go through how to actually find deals, so identify the market, how to find deals within the market, how to actually close on the deal, how to get the financing for the deal, then how to set it up, how to create like a awesome listing that stands out, how to set up your profile on Airbnb, and then how to automate some of this stuff like cleaners. That's another big thing. People are like, I don't have a cleaning crew, or I don't have a handyman. Those are two key people that you need. And then how to automate the whole guest communication process to make it as hands-off as it can be. It'll still be somewhat hands-on, but there's things you can do to make it much, much easier.
And then who's your ideal student? Who of our listeners are you really speaking to here?
It's somebody who's working a full-time job, or you know, it could be somebody who's flipping, because that for me was a full-time job, and I wanted a lifeline at the time. I wish I would have known about this and just skipped flipping altogether, because I could have been financially free years and years ago. And you know, so somebody working a full-time job, they've heard about Airbnb, they've thought about it for a while maybe, but they just are confused where to start. Like, how do I run the numbers? How do I know once I buy something that somebody's actually going to rent it? And how many nights are they going to rent it from me? And all the questions that pop up. And what I've experienced is that there's always like one or two things that come up for people, like, you know, how do I run the numbers? How do I find cleaners? That stop them from moving forward. And they've thought about this for a year. And during that year, they could have made $50,000 of cash flow on a property potentially, but there's these little things that are easy to overcome if you have the answer. So it's ideal for someone like that really is like, all right, I need somebody to walk me through this now and get me to the point where I have one of these done, so then I can move forward and scale it from there.
That's awesome. That's awesome, man. So what else besides real estate? We only have like 10 minutes left. I wanted to ask you, what other stuff besides real estate are you working on right now? Like, I feel like you're an interesting dude. Like, you might have a book, you might have like a not-for-profit, you know, like a skincare product you're selling. Like, what's going on?
How can we be as handsome as you? That's what Frank is asking you right now.
Like, if anyone's watching the video, it's like John and I are about 10 years younger than Kirby, but I at least live like 5 years older. So I always make this joke.
Throw that in there.
Yeah, always.
Yeah, I actually just had my surprise 40th birthday this past weekend. My wife threw it for me 3 months early, so it was really a surprise. And so I'm right on the cusp of being 40 years old. So, but no, I have plenty of gray hairs. They're all, I guess, in the back. You can't see them with this lighting or whatever. But yeah, I mean, so I just left a nonprofit that I was super passionate about. It helped veterans start businesses. I thought it helped me tremendously when I was getting started. But part of the reason why I left the nonprofit is because we just bought a 45-acre farm. So that's where I live right now, is in a farmhouse that was built in 1853. So prior to the Lincoln administration. And it needed a lot of work. So we gutted the house initially. The intent behind it is, this worked so well for us. The short-term rental model worked well for us in our basement in the previous single-family house, that why don't we scale it on something on our personal residence, but on a bigger scale. So we started getting into this whole concept of land hacking and which is basically where you find land with a house on it, so it qualifies for conventional financing, and then you buy it. You buy it using conventional finance. They appraise the house, and it just happens to come with a whole bunch of land that you can do a ton of rentals on. So that's what we're working on now. We got the whole house rehab. We got the barn. There's a 100-year-old barn here that we rehabbed and put these big windows in. And I think it's a perfect place to have a wedding. And we've actually rented our house out on Airbnb a couple times now, just to test the waters, and it's worked out great. People want to get out of the city, and they come out here just for like a long weekend, and they get to pet our chickens and hang out on the farm. So the next phase is to build out like yurts or tiny houses or cabins or some type of small rentals that, it's a huge hay field surrounded by woods, and there's a river that runs through the corner that the salmon actually run on from Lake Michigan. So I think it'd be a perfect place for people to get away, come out to the farm, eat some homegrown vegetables that we're growing, and pet the chickens and goats, and hang out for the weekend. So that's the thought.
Dude, I'm sold. Like, Frank, next offsite, we're going to Kirby's, man.
Right.
I want to pet some chickens.
That's actually a great idea, because we travel for our offsites because none of us live within an hour of each other, so we always fly. That's a great idea. We actually should do that. That's awesing, man.
Come on out.
You're doing it, dude. No. That's creative. That's pretty cool.
We got to put up a few rentals first before you get here, but so right now the process we're at, or the step in the process, is working with the county. So it's every county's different on what they'll allow. So we've got to get a variance to allow us to do something here. And so we're working on like a venue / either campground or something a little bit more permanent to allow more permanent structures. So
excellent. And here's my question for you is, one of the things Frank and I are all about scale, where maybe we need to trip like you did a little bit to be grounded, but Frank and I are like, if we can't do it 100 times, we might as well not do it once, right? So one of the things we've talked about is creating a short-term rental fund, right? Like raising a couple $1 million, picking a city, and being able to have some economics of scale, or right to grow out a solid short-term rental fund. What are your thoughts there? Is that something that we should pursue? And our assumptions there is we're pretty good at finding deals. We're pretty good at using virtual assistants to run a lot of those systems. Do you think that's a feasible business model?
So by the way, like I'm not down on scale. Like, I know it probably sounds that way. I just know me like that. And that's been the biggest game changer, is getting to know yourself. Because initially when I got into real estate, I listened to gurus. I went to every one of the seminars. I signed up for a bunch of courses, and I was just listening to anyone that I thought looked successful. And they were all flashy guys standing in front of their fancy cars, and they're saying like, this is what you got to do to be successful. You got to grow, and you got to, do all. And then halfway through, I realized that guy is not me. I have no desire to be like that dude. And like, if I can be hanging out on a farm with my kids and drive an old pickup truck, like that's really successful for me. Like that's my picture of success, and not have to go to work in the morning. Like I don't have a job. Like I get to do what I want, set my own days, and I don't have a car payment, and so like those are so you have to define what success is for you. So like, if scale excite, like you can do a lot with scale, like, that I couldn't do because I'm a solopreneur. So there's a lot more impact you can make with scale, but it has to align with your personality. So that being said, like, I think it's a super smart thing to do. I've had a few people on my podcast actually who are buying small commercial buildings and converting them into Airbnbs, and the numbers are insane because the rent rates go through the roof, and then the value is based on the rent rate. So I think it's really smart strategy. I always teach people, because I'm working with people who are starting with their first one, that they have a huge competitive advantage over like the Evolves of the world, because they can be hands-on. They can provide an intimate experience. Our guests love our places. The feedback is raving, because we like have handwritten notes. It's like, here's all the places we like to go in town. There's a story about us. There's a whole history of the entire city that we put up on these canvases in each one of our units. Like all these little touches that once you're at scale, just don't make any sense anymore. So just know your business model. Somebody once told me that you can either be a super host or you can have a successful short-term rental business. And I was like, well, what is that? Like, aren't successful people super hosts? And his point, I think it was like, I don't think it's actually factual, but I think his point was like, to be a super host, you have to meet all these guidelines that Airbnb is like, they want you to be hands-on, like a super host, like never cancel on someone, all these things that are very specific to have a successful short-term rental business at scale. You're not going to be able to adhere to all those individual super host things. So I think you still probably could if you did it the right way, but it's, you have to identify what your business model is, what you're okay with, like, and then, I think it absolutely could work really well. The numbers are just, they don't make any sense right now. There's a huge supply and demand differential that's just not met there right now. There's way more people who want to use Airbnb than there's enough properties on Airbnb right now. So it makes it very profitable.
Don't be too loud, Kirby, or BlackRock's going to buy up all the single family housing even faster.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right. I feel like that's all we got for today. Is that right, John? Are we done?
Yeah, I just want to ask Kirby one more question, which is
sure.
The money question, which is where can people find you? And I would also say that we really like Kirby, right? We are giving him, I don't know the specifics of his course, but this is what I can guarantee. He's a high character guy, right? We talk about character and how, unfortunately, a lot of real estate investors need to work on their character. I absolutely trust Kirby's character, and I'm sure he's going to give you an awesome experience, awesome education. So we don't get any financial kickbacks. We don't want any financial kickbacks from Kirby, but we highly, highly recommend, if you're interested in short-term rentals, to check out his course. I guarantee you it'll be top notch. But Kirby, if someone is interested in your course and some of your materials, where can they find out more about you, man?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's real simple. I'm going to be doing a webinar here soon, and it's on August 9th, I believe, live. So if you just go to livingoffrentals.com/webinar. So Living Off Rentals is my platform, and /webinar, you can get the information right there. You can register for the webinar, and I'm going to go over my process. Basically, on the webinar, I'm going to go over my process for finding short-term rentals, buying short-term rentals, and setting them up. And so if you want to find out more, I'd say, join the webinar. If it's after August 9th, you're listening to this, you can still go to that site, and the webinar will still be living there, the recording. So you can check it out there. And then reach out on any social platform. My email is kirby@greenvethomes.com. That's my real estate investing company. And so happy to chat with anyone.
Awesome. Really appreciate your time, Kirby. I think we learn from you every time we talk. So thanks so much. Appreciate it. Frank, take us away, brother.
Just one more thank you to Kirby. You're an awesome guest. We love having you on, and I'm sure we'll have you on before the end of Q3. Peace, brother.
Thanks, man.